Well, today, we're down to the last 2 weeks in our series through the life of Joshua. And today's message I've called A Time of Division. And we're going to ultimately put most of our attention on chapter 22. But really, we're covering 8 chapters this morning. Can you believe that? Chapters 15 all the way through chapter 22. But our main focus is going to be on chapter 22. Now, chapters 15 through 21 deal with the distribution of the land. You might remember I told you last week and the week before that you can divide the book of Joshua into 3 parts. Chapters 1 through 5 is Israel entering the promised land. Chapters 6 through 12, Israel conquering the land. And then last week we started with chapter 13 because chapter 13 to the end of the book is Israel distributing the land. Now chapters 15 through 19 really read like a land contract. Here's all the different people, here's the names and the borders of the lands they get, and it's very important stuff, and there's some really good things in there. But I'm not going to take time today to read those hundreds and hundreds of massive names to you. You can read chapters 15 through chapters 19 on your own. But here's Joshua. He's now over 100 years old. He now needs to lead Israel in distributing the land. Now, the reality of that is seen in the fact that, first of all, there's the dividing of the land of Canaan. Every tribe gets a parcel of ground. That takes you through chapter 19. You can read that on your own. But chapter 20 and 21, both are very short chapters, and you can read those on your own too. They deal with particular cities. In chapter 20, we learn about cities of refuge. And here's what God did. All throughout the promised land, God put 6 different cities of refuge. And no matter where you lived, you were within a day's journey of a city of refuge. There were 2 in the north, 2 in the central, 2 in the south. Now, what were cities of refuge? They were really cities of judicial asylum. Now, here's what you have to keep in mind. That back in that day, there were no prisons. There wasn't law enforcement. Justice was served swiftly, but it was really street justice is what it was. And it was the eye for the eye and the tooth for the tooth. And every family had an avenger of blood. And if you killed somebody in my family, our avenger of blood is going to come after you. That's really how it worked. But there were obviously situations where you might be accused of killing someone and you didn't do it. Or perhaps it was completely accidental. Well, what you could do at that point to be protected from the avenger of blood is you could flee to one of these 6 cities. And when you got there, they would take you in, and they would do a kind of a court session. The elders of the city would look into your case. And if it was deemed you were innocent, or the death was accidental, you could stay in that city and be protected. It was a city of refuge. There were 6 of them. You can read about that on your own in chapter 20. Now, chapter 21 deals with a different type of city. I call them cities of righteousness, and there were 48 of them. And no matter where you lived in the land of promise, you were within 10 miles of one of these cities. Now, these were the cities where the Levites lived. If you remember last week, we talked about the fact that every tribe got a parcel of land except the Levites. The Levites were spread throughout the promised land in 48 different cities. Now, why was that the case? Well, there's good news and bad news. Let's start with the bad news. The bad news is if you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, you realize why they don't get a parcel of land. Why are they divided throughout all of the territory? And here's why. Because their forefather Levi sinned. And part of the consequence to his sin was that his descendants would be scattered throughout the land. That's the bad news. However, even in the midst of that consequence, there was good news. Because God used that good news in order to bless Israel, because now no matter where you lived in Israel, you had Levites within 10 miles of you. Now, Levites were the priests. They're the ones who taught you the law of God. They're the ones that led you in the worship of God. And even though they're spread all over the land because of Levi's sin, remember, we serve a God who can work all things together for good, Romans 8:28, and he uses even the consequence of Levi's sin to ultimately be a blessing to all of Israel. In fact, the greatest man ever born, who was that? Well, according to Jesus, it was John the Baptist. He was a Levite. So even though this was due to the consequence of sin, God still used it to be a blessing to others. And I love that principle. And here's the reason I love it. The reason I love that principle is real simple. Because I'm a sinner. And I love the fact that even though there are consequences to my sin, when I sin, God isn't done with me. And even though there's consequences to my sin, even in the midst of those consequences, God can still use me to be a blessing to others. And he can you too. Never get into the mindset that says, because there's a particular sin in my past, God can't use me anymore. Folks, please understand, there will always be consequences to your sin, but it doesn't end there. Even in the midst of the consequence of your sin, our God can still use you to bless other people. And that's what we see among the cities of righteousness. Now, I want to show you real quick a map. You may have a hard time seeing it, but this is a map that shows the division of the land. I would encourage you, when you get home today, to Google this. Just Google division of the promised land, a map, and you'll get one of these to look at. Now, I want to remind you of something that's really important for us to understand what happens in chapter 22, and that's the key chapter I want to look at today. Remember that 2.5 of the tribes, that's the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, they asked for their portion of land on the other side of the Jordan River before they crossed. Now, if you look at this map, you might be able to notice there are 3 bodies of water. To the very left, there's the Mediterranean Sea. That's the big one. Towards the middle of the upper part, you'll see the Sea of Galilee, that little spot of water. And then if you go directly south from there, you'll see the bigger body of water. That's the Dead Sea. And in between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea flows the Jordan River. Now, when Israel is getting ready to cross the Jordan River to come into the promised land, 3 of the tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, said to Moses, "Can we have our land over here?" Now, why did they want the land on that side of the Jordan? It wasn't good for farming, but that was very good land for cattle. And they had lots of cattle. So they asked for that land, and Moses made a deal with them. Remember, Moses said, here's the deal. Your fighting men must still come with us to help conquer the land. If they'll do that, you can stay over here. And they agreed. So the fighting men from Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh crosses the Jordan River, and they go into the land with the rest of Israel to conquer it. Now, that's going to set up something we're going to see happen today. Now, before we look at it, though, let me just give you the main components of what's going to happen. In just a moment, we're going to see that the fighting men of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh are allowed to go back to their own land and their own families. But they're going to do something over there. Now, they're going to do it very innocently. There's going to be no ulterior motives. There's no sin involved, but they're going to do something. And there's going to be some folks on the west side of the river, the other 9.5 tribes, that see it. And they're going to assume the worst. And they're going to convince themselves that Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, they are disobeying God. And then you know what they're going to do? They're going to fan that flame through the means of gossip. And gossip is going to spread through the 9.5 tribes to the point where the 9.5 tribes all come together at Shiloh and say, let's cross the Jordan and make war with them. Israel will be on the brink of a civil war. Now think about it. They just got done defeating all of these massive armies in the land. And now they're on the brink of a civil war that could wipe out 1/6 of their population. And it all happens because they falsely assumed and then gossiped. Now, why is this such a critical chapter? Even though Joshua is never mentioned in the chapter, why is it critical? Here's why. Because we follow the same pattern today. How many civil wars have taken place in local churches? Because someone assumed the worst, gossiped, and it resulted in a division. So that's what we're going to see as we look at this. But first of all, notice it begins with a dispute over an altar. Now here's what happens in chapter 22. First you see the charge to the 2.5 tribes, and it begins with a commendation. And basically here's what Joshua does. We're not going to read all the verses. We'll read some of them. I hope you'll read the whole chapter today. He brings Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh to him, and he blesses them. He commends them. He says, listen, you did your duty. You fulfilled your vow. You came with us, leaving your families behind on the other side of the Jordan. You fought with us. Now the battles are done, and I'm releasing you to go back home and be part of your families. Now this commendation involves the commissioning. Look what he says in verse number 4 of chapter 22. It says, and now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers, the other 9.5 tribes, as he spoke to them. Therefore, turn now and go to your tents on the other side, to the land of your possession, where your families are, where your cattle is, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond the Jordan. Now, please understand, it's been 7 years since the Jordan River crossing. These fighting men have been faithful to their vow for 7 years. Their families have been left behind on the other side of the Jordan for 7 years. This was quite a commitment they made. And now Joshua's releasing them. He is now saying, your tour of duty is over. Job well done, mission accomplished. You can go back home. But I love what he does in verse number 5. In verse number 5, he doesn't let them leave without giving them a challenge. Now, when we think of the book of Joshua, the most famous verse in the book of Joshua actually comes in the chapters remaining. It's when Joshua says to Israel, choose you this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I bet you that a large percentage of you have that verse somewhere in your home. On some plaque, on some picture, on some bookmark. It's the most famous verse in the book of Joshua, and it's a great verse. But if I had to pick just one verse from the book of Joshua and say this is the one we ought to put on our wall, I would pick this one. Joshua chapter 22, verse number 5. In fact, I want to challenge you. I want to dare you. I want to double dog dare you. No, I want to triple dog dare you. I want to guilt you into memorizing this verse this week. You are not a good American if you don't memorize this verse. You might get to heaven, but you'll be in the back, all right? This is the verse. I want to encourage you. I printed it out this week and I put it on my wall right above my desk so I could see it many times a day. What an incredible challenge. This is the challenge Moses gives Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh before they go back over to their families. Look what he says. It's a powerful verse. He says, only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you. To love the Lord your God and walk in all his ways and keep his commandments and hold fast to him and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. You don't love Jesus if you don't memorize that this week, all right? You really need to memorize that verse. It's powerful. By the way, all of those phrases come from the book of Deuteronomy. All of them. Now, they're not necessarily direct quotes, but these are the themes in the book of Deuteronomy. Let me just break them down. The overall theme is this: observe the commandments of Moses. Moses gave you the commandments from God in the book of Deuteronomy, so as you go back over to the land, you need to be careful to observe them. Now, notice what some of them are, and he begins to list them. First of all, love the Lord your God. That's the first one. It's a theme in the book of Deuteronomy. As you go back across the river, stay devoted and loyal to God. Love God with all your heart. By the way, you might recall that in the Gospels, Jesus will quote from that verse in Deuteronomy. When they try to trap Jesus and say, out of the over 600 commands, which one's the most important? And Jesus says, no sweat, no problem. I don't even have to pray about this one. It's this: love the Lord your God with all your heart. So he says, as you go back over, you need to love the Lord your God. Now, what does that look like? Well, if you love the Lord your God, you're going to next walk in God's ways. And that's a theme in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, notice the word walk. The word walk indicates it's step by step. In other words, if I'm really going to love the Lord my God, that means I'm going to walk in God's ways with every step I take. Every step I take, I'm loving God. Every word I speak, I'm loving God. Every thought I think, I'm loving God. Now, if you go and you read the New Testament, you'll discover that Paul makes this a major theme in his writings. How often does Paul say, walk in a manner worthy of the one who called you? Walk in the Spirit so you don't fulfill the lust of the flesh. It becomes a common theme in the New Testament, step by step, word by word, thought by thought. Love God. And that brings us to the next one. Keep His commandments. How do I know if I love God? Real simple. Jesus gave us the litmus test. Remember what he said? If you love me, you'll what? Keep my commandments. So Joshua says, listen, as you get back over to the other side, you got to love God with everything you have. He must be your priority. That means that step by step, word by word, thought by thought, you're going to obey the commandments of God. And then he says this to them. He says, hold fast to God. The word hold fast means to cling to. In Genesis, the word is used to describe Adam and Eve as they get married and the two become one flesh. Jesus used this same concept in the Gospel of John when he said, I am the vine, you're the branches. We hold fast to each other. We never let go. When you get to the other side of the Jordan and you're surrounded by nations that worship idols, hold fast to God. When you're tempted to sin, hold fast to God. When storms come into your life that shake your faith, hold fast to God. Isn't this an incredible verse? All of this in one verse of the Bible. And then finally he says this, and serve God, and here's the key, with all your heart. Now notice, he didn't just say serve God. He said serve God how? With all your heart. You see, here's the truth. The truth is that most people in this room today served God this week. But few people served God this week with all their heart. One verse packed with power. We could have made that a 6-week series right there. I encourage you to memorize that verse this week. And that's the challenge Moses gives them. Basically, he's saying this: your military commitment has come to an end, but your spiritual commitment is just beginning. And those guys now leave. They go back to the other side to their homes. And that brings up the problem. And the problem happens due to a construction project. That's what brings about the problem. There's a construction process that happens. Look at Joshua 22. Let me jump down to verse 10. Look what it says. Now, when they came to the region of the Jordan, they're on their way back to their families. When they came to the region of the Jordan, which is still in the land of Canaan, They're still on the west side. The sons of Reuben, the sons of Gad, half of Manasseh, those fighting men, they built an altar there right by the Jordan River. Before they crossed, they built, and look, it's large. And that's the emphasis in the Hebrew language there. It is large in appearance. Now, it seems from the rest of the text that we can ascertain that it was kind of a huge replica of the altar of incense that was in the tabernacle, which at this time rested in Shiloh. And they built an enormous one. You could see it from both sides of the river. They build this huge altar, and then they cross back over to their land. Now, this is where the problem comes in. Because now there's a concern. And this concern rests in the hearts and minds of the 9.5 tribes still there on the west side of the Jordan. And a few of them see this. And notice what it says in verse 11. Look at it. And the sons of Israel heard it. Some people saw it, and then they began to gossip. They began to talk about it. News begins to spread. Behold, the sons of Reuben, the sons of Gad, the half-tribe of Manasseh, they have built this enormous altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan, in the region of the Jordan, on the side belonging to us. And when the sons of Israel heard of it, as this gossip spread, the whole congregation of Israel gathered themselves at Shiloh to pray for the 2.5 tribes. No, that's not what they gathered to do. They gathered at Shiloh to go up against them in war. Wow! They are on the brink of a civil war. Now, I want to spend some time here because I want to talk about two major problems that bring this about. Problem number one is this. When there were some folks on the west side of the Jordan River, the 9.5 tribes, when there were some folks who saw this huge altar, they immediately assumed the worst. And here's what they assumed. We'll see this later in the text. They assumed that the tribe of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh were being disobedient to God. Now, how were they being disobedient? By building this gigantic altar. Well, if you go back to Numbers and Deuteronomy, you'll discover that God had established for the Jewish people in the Old Testament the law of central worship. And that simply meant this, that there was one place where Israel gathered to worship their one God. At this time, it's Shiloh. Now, later in the New Testament, it will be in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. But right now, it's at Shiloh. And every single man of Israel was commanded by God 3 times a year to come to this central location to offer their sin sacrifice to God. And it appears to the people on the 9.5 tribes that these guys are doing it different. They're going against God. They're doing their own worship. They're doing their own thing. They're disobeying God. They're not doing it God's way. You might recall that the first murder that ever occurred over this very incident. Cain and Abel. God had given one way for them to worship him, a blood sacrifice. Abel obeyed. Cain brought a vegan sacrifice. Obviously, God's not a vegan because he didn't accept that sacrifice. And Cain ends up killing Abel, because he tried to do a different means and method of worship. Well, that's what they assume these guys are doing. And they get scared because they're like, wait, remember when Achan sinned? It hurt us all. We need to go over there and wipe them out before their sin affects us. So it all begins with them assuming the worst. Now, folks, can we just be honest? We do that every day. We do it every day. I've taught you this principle before, but let me review it with you. And the principle is this, that in every relationship in your life, there will be a gap at times between what you expect of someone and what you actually experience from them. It happens in marriage all the time, doesn't it? I expect my spouse to do this, but the experience is there's a gap. It happens at work. It happens with our kids, with our parents. It happens with friends. It happens with pastors. I guarantee you, every one of you in this room, if you've been attending E-Free long enough, every one of you in this room can think of a time where what you expected of your pastor fell short of what you experienced. If that's not happened yet, just hang on, it will, okay? Because in every relationship you're in, that happens. Now, this is important, and here's why. Because you will always fill the gap. When there's a gap between what you expect of someone and what you experience, you will always fill the gap. And what you fill the gap with will determine how you respond. If you fill the gap with suspicion, like these guys did, oh, I bet they did it for this reason. I bet he did it for this reason. I bet this was his motive. When you fill that gap with suspicion, when you fill that gap with false assumption, when you fill that gap by judging their motive, you will respond negatively. But if you fill that gap with trust, if you fill that gap with a mindset that says, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, then you'll react lovingly. By the way, the same thing is true in your relationship with God. How many of you know there are times in your walk with the Lord that what you expect of God doesn't match what you experience? Have you ever been there? I prayed for this over and over and over and over again, but God didn't come through, and there's a gap. And you know what's easy to do? It's easy to fill that gap with suspicion. Well, God must not love me. Well, God must be mad at me. Well, God must not be as good as I thought he was. And we fill the gap with suspicion, and we begin to get angry at God. Rather than filling the gap with trust and say, okay, God, you didn't do it the way I wanted you to, but I'm going to trust you because you know best. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm still going to serve you. I'm still going to love you. You see, this is a principle we deal with every day. And folks, listen. Most church splits and church divisions started not with an error in theology, but with false assumption when we filled the gap with negative stuff. That's what the 9.5 tribes do. They immediately conclude they're disobeying God. They've got bad motives. Let's kill them. In fact, what happened is some of them see this altar. They come to this conclusion that's very clear from the first line, and the sons of Israel heard it. They begin to spread it. Now gossip takes place. Now gossip. First there's false assumption. Now folks, please understand, false assumption is the lowest form of communication. It always goes wrong. But now when you take the flame caused by false assumption and you fan it with gossip, it turns into an inferno. And that's what happens. It starts spreading all through Israel. And now there is this major anger and hatred and wanting for action. I bet that a high percentage of church divisions have started with these words. Hey, did you hear about so-and-so? I really believe with all my heart that one of the greatest threats to E-Free Church is gossip. I think it's one of the greatest threats. And you know why? Because we're all guilty. We're all guilty. You say, not me. Okay, now wait, let's define this. Before you just self-righteously say, I don't gossip, let's define it. Gossip is any time I tell someone else something negative about you behind your back when that person doesn't need to know. That's gossip. Anytime I share something negative about you or somebody else behind your back to somebody who doesn't need to know. Can I just make it clear? Just because they're a family member doesn't mean they need to know. Yeah, there's no amens happening today, is there? Just because they're a friend doesn't mean they need to know. Well, I don't do that. Well, let me go a step further. In case I haven't made you angry yet, let me try one more thing. If you listen to it, you've still committed the sin. If you listen to the gossip, if you listen to someone who comes to you and says, did you hear about so-and-so? I believe that gossip is one of the greatest threats to our church because we all do it. I was listening to a preacher while I was walking. I like to listen to sermons while I walk every day, and I like to listen to guys who I trust and what they're saying about the passage I'm preaching on. And I was listening to one guy, and he said he's developed 5 questions that when someone comes to him and they gossip, they start with the words, hey, can I need to tell you about so-and-so. He has 5 questions. These aren't on the screen, but you may want to write them down because they're good ones to use, because this will take the wind right out of a gossip's sails, okay? Number 1, he asked him this question. Why are you telling me this? Why are you telling me this? Question number 2. Where did you get your information? Well, I can't tell you who told me. Then why are you telling me something you can't tell? Okay? Why are you telling me this? Where did you get your information? Number 3. Have you already gone directly to that person? The person you're talking, have you already gone directly to them like Jesus told you you should? 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. Isn't it amazing how we just kind of wax over what Jesus said on that one? Have you gone to that person yet? Oh, no. I'm just telling you so you'll pray for them. Well, I'm not going to pray for them. How about if I pray for you that you'll get your life right because you're gossiping right now? You say that once or twice, people won't come to you with gossip anymore. Number 1, why are you telling me? Number 2, what's your source? Number 3, have you already gone directly to that person? Number 4, have you checked out your facts? Oh, by the way, if you've not gone to the person, you haven't checked out your facts. And then number 5, if this one doesn't end it, number 5 will. Here it is, ready? When I go talk to that person, may I use your name? Oh yeah, that'll stop it right there, won't it? You see, ladies and gentlemen, we have to understand that one of the greatest threats we face as a church is the threat of false assumption that's fanned by the flame of gossip. And as a result, these folks are furious. Now, they're so furious, here's what they do. They put a delegation together and say, we want you to go over there and talk to them. Now, this delegation is not a fact-finding delegation. That's very obvious. They're not going over there to see if it's true. They believe it is true. In fact, the first words that will come out of their mouth is, you have committed a treachery. They're not going over there to see if it's true. They're going over there to say, listen, repent or we're taking you out. And guess what? This delegation is headed by a guy named Phineas. Now, who's Phineas? Phineas was the son of Eleazar, the high priest. Do you know what Phineas is known for in the Bible? His zeal for righteousness. It was a good thing. In fact, you can read a story in the Bible where Phineas sees a priest take a Moabite woman into his tent to have sexual relations with her, so he grabs a spear, goes in, and with one thrust, right through both of them. This dude was serious. This is not the guy you want being your judge, okay? If he was in the West, he'd be the hanging judge. If you're going to go before Phineas, you're done. And they send Phineas, you go get him. So Phineas and the delegation go over to confront them. And you can read about that confrontation. They just let him have it. They let him have it. Now, let's notice now the commitment of these 2.5 tribes. Notice how they respond. They're taken back. Because remember, I told you earlier, we'll see it here. They did this with no ill intention at all. Their motives were good. Look at what they say after they hear this huge onslaught of accusation. It says, then the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh, verse 21, answered and spoke to the heads of the families that came with Phinehas. And here's what they said. First words out of their mouth. The mighty one God, the Lord. The mighty one God, the Lord. He knows. Now let me stop for a second. That's powerful. They actually use all three of the major names for God and then repeat it. The mighty one, God, the Lord. The mighty one, God, the Lord. He knows our heart. In the Hebrew, they really said this. In the Hebrew, I'm sure I get it right. They said, El Elohim Yahweh. El Elohim Yahweh. We are still committed to God. He knows our heart. You guys have us all wrong. And look what they say. Let's keep reading. He knows, now may Israel also know. And if it was in rebellion, if that's why we built this altar, or if in an unfaithful act against the Lord, then don't save us. Then come wipe us out. Then you need to kill us. If we did this out of rebellion, if we did this out of unfaithfulness to God, then we deserve punishment. Keep reading. If we've built us an altar to turn away from following the Lord, or to offer burnt offerings and grain offerings differently than the Lord commanded us to, may the Lord himself require that of us. And they look at Phinehas and they look at these other leaders and they say, you got it all wrong. God knows our heart. If we did this for a wrong reason, then let God take us out right now, because God knows our heart. And now as you keep reading, in verse number, 24, they give the real reason they built the altar. It really was a good reason. It may not have been necessary, but it was a good reason. Look at it. But truly, we built this altar out of concern, not out of rebellion. For a reason. We had a reason. Here's the reason. In time to come, your sons on the other side of the Jordan River, the 9.5 tribes, your sons may say to our sons over here, what have you to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? Look, the Lord made the Jordan a border between us, and you sons of Reuben and Gad, you have no portion in the land. See, here was their concern. They realized the principle that is a true principle. Out of sight, out of mind. And their fear was, since they were now separated from the other 9.5 tribes by the river, since they were kind of now the other campus, they're the Sault Ste. Marie campus now, and they're separated from the Gaylord campus. Because that was there, their fear was, we're going to be forgotten. Their fear was, we'll become the redheaded stepchild. No offense if you're redheaded. The fear was that your sons someday are going to look at our sons and say, you're not part of us. Look, you're on the other side of the tracks. God even put a border between us. And we wanted to build something as a memorial to remind our sons and to remind your sons that we are of the same family and we serve the same God. So keep reading. It says, go ahead and go back one verse. I want to finish that one. Can you go back one slide? Let me pick it up where it says, therefore we said, halfway down, let us build an altar. Not for burnt offering or sacrifice. It was going to be a bloodless altar. Rather, it's just a witness, a memorial between us and you, between our generations after us, that we're to perform the service of the Lord before him with our burnt offerings. We did this as a reminder to all of us we're on the same team. Now let's go ahead and jump forward to verse number 28 and notice the final thing they say. Therefore we said, it will come about if they say to us or to our generation in time to come, then we shall say, no, see this copy of the altar of the Lord which our fathers made? It's a witness between you and me. Far be it from us that we should rebel against the Lord and turn away from following the Lord by building an altar for burnt offering. That's not why we did. You've got it all wrong. Our intentions were good. Our concern was valid. Do you see how close Israel came to civil war? because of false assumption, fanned into flame by gossip. If only Israel at the beginning would have said, whoa, what's that altar they built? Let's go talk to them and find out. And I think chapter 22, even though it doesn't mention Joshua, is in the Bible for a very good reason. Because that's the same pattern that divides churches today. There will be times in church when what you expect of church leaders, what you expect of each other, will not be what you experience. And there will be a gap. And trust me, you will fill that gap. And if you fill it with suspicion, if you fill it with false assumption, if you fill it by trying to judge motives even though you really can't know someone's motives, then you will respond negatively. 1 Corinthians 13 is the great love chapter. It's usually used in weddings. Every time you hear it read, it's a wedding. But it's actually not a chapter that deals with marriage. It's a chapter that deals with the church. Here's how to love each other in the church. It gives 16 specific ways, and one of them is this: love trusts. Another translation says, love believes. You see, if I truly love you as a brother or sister in Christ, when that time comes, when there's a gap between what I expected of you and what I've experienced, I will fill that gap by saying this: I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Until such time as it's proven different, I will give them the benefit of the doubt. When the experience of your mate doesn't match your expectation, give them the benefit of the doubt. When people at works, when your experience with them doesn't match your expectations, give them the benefit of the doubt. And folks, when your pastor doesn't meet your expectations, when your experience of your pastor falls short of your expectations, please give me the benefit of the doubt. That's the biblical way to deal with the gap. And when we don't deal with it biblically, the result is division. Would you pray with me? Father, this chapter in Scripture is one that is an amazing story. And we almost sit back kind of shocked. How could the 9.5 tribes do that? Until we really take time to say, you know what? The truth is we do that all the time. I needed this message this week. I needed it. Because I can think of many times in recent days and weeks when I filled the gap with suspicion instead of trust. I can think of times in the past days and weeks when I shared something negative about another believer behind their back with somebody who didn't need to know. And though in the church today we kind of have labeled those respectable sins, the truth of the matter is they're the dangerous ones, because they're the ones that can cause division. So God, I pray that you would help us in our marriages, in our relationships, in our neighborhoods. Help us at work, at school, and at church to always fill the gap with trust, to refuse to be part of gossip, help us to love each other as ourselves. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.